Chapter 5. The Producer. Gary Stromberg, a record and film producer at Universal Studios in North Hollywood, had an incidental music scout inside the prison on Terminal Island. Phil Kaufman was doing time for international marijuana smuggling when he heard Charlie's music and referred him by letter to Stromberg. Charlie was just getting around to arranging that meeting. He called Stromberg from a payphone in Los Angeles. On our way through the gate at Universal, I tucked in my shirt and tied my moccasins in bows. When Charlie got out of the bus, he took one look at me, laughed, and pulled down my shirt tail. Walking towards Stromberg's office, I noticed we were parked in a space reserved for Cary Grant. Stromberg was young and well-fed. Everything about him was glossy. In friendly small talk, he referred to the letter he'd received from Phil and asked how Charlie was getting along. Charlie said that the world had changed a lot in 7 years, and they laughed about the cultural transformations. In upshot, Stromberg seemed to like Charlie. He had another appointment, but asked Charlie to return later in the week to use the recording studio. I was stoked. We left the studio for Manhattan Beach to find Bill, another Terminal Island alumnus, and impose upon his lack of hospitality. I was surprised when he answered the door. Bill was eye-catching, from his surfboard feet to his angular jaw. But his eyes were unwelcoming, and we could barely hear him introducing us to Patty, the modest brunette sitting on his couch. I could tell at a glance she didn't live there. Charlie ignored Bill's cold shoulder, telling him of places we'd been and asking him about himself. Bill offered us a bit of nothing from his hollow refrigerator, took a beer for himself, and rocked back on 2 legs of his chair, while Charlie played guitar and Patty listened intently. In contrast to her friend, she was pale, with deep brown Cleopatra hair, narrow shoulders, and bare white arms that came to rest softly against her jeans. And, unlike Bill, she gave us a great, welcoming smile. Charlie walked Patty to her apartment that night and didn't come back. Mary and I slept on Bill's 2 sofas. The next day, Patty and I set out for a corner store, both of us barefoot and a little shy, and discovered that for part of our lives, we had lived less than 6 blocks apart. She was half a grade ahead of me at Orville Wright Junior High in Westchester. We'd probably passed each other in the school dozens of times, and we nearly passed the store talking about it. Since high school, her life had been devoted to the downtown branch of an insurance company, an empty spot of beach and her imagination, in which, she said, she had conjured us up. A long time ago, but then it is always now, a disenchanted and frightened girl wandered aimlessly upon the sands of the Pacific shore, her mind filled with doubts and cares, knowing all is meaningless except the love of one another, but unwilling to extend her heart for fear of rejection. She might have ended as she had planned so often, a body swept upon the shore by the tide. 'Twas but a smile, a true smile, one which you could touch with the warmth of your heart and a glance, not like many you take, but one where you can travel between two pairs of eyes, meet in the middle, and know there is no beginning or end. A sudden load laid from your shoulders, and a sureness of your faith. And to your own surprise, you find someone who understands your every thought. A friend, much more. A reflection of yourself. The hidden beauty that you find openly in another face looking into your own. In that strange stillness of unspeakable aloneness and together that brought me here to now. 'Twas but a few days before Charlie, Mary, Lynn, and I began traveling the roads in a cozy VW bus, exchanging thoughts composed of all our fears, sorrows, and loves, making of each other a family, strong by the bonds of understanding, experience of the road filling the longing of wants and making of us all one spirit of joy and laughter. For as long as you are together with each other, there is no moment of despair. Patricia Krenwinkel, Sybil Brand Institute for Women in Los Angeles, California, 1970. If that doesn't illustrate how florid and gentle Patricia Krenwinkel was, perhaps nothing could. Her parents had divorced when she was in high school, her mother returning to Mobile, Alabama, while her father, an insurance broker, continued to live in Southern California. Her only sibling, an older half-sister whose apartment she shared, would go on to an untimely end, and she too, arguably, the most inexplicable mass homicide of its time. During our second visit to Universal Studios, we girls were permitted to sit with Charlie by the microphones in the recording studio. Stromberg encouraged him over a speaker from the soundproof booth and played for us a tape of high-beat African music from a group he had recently produced. Then he suggested that Charlie tell some stories while playing the songs he had written in prison. For some reason, Charlie waned. He said that his prison songs were old and there was much more happening in the streets. Stromberg assured him that people wanted to hear about prison. So Charlie tuned the guitar and unraveled some stories. But he never seemed comfortable. He said that while in prison, he had considered a job playing music, but that was 100 years past, and just an old ego. That's okay, Stromberg told him. Just play anything. So, Charlie launched into the ego song and a few others. He was cordial and at times comedic, but his heart wasn't in that studio, and I felt that even he didn't know why. Clang, bang, clang went the big iron door, They put me in a cell with a concrete floor. 9 other men in that cell with me, moaning their date with destiny. Charles Manson, Prison Song, 1967. After the session, Stromberg told us he'd been kicking around a movie concept about what Jesus Christ would be doing if he came back today. With the beards, the long hair, and the sandals, today's young generation could relate. Sure, Charlie said. The kids aren't interested in the money. They're interested in the spirit. They're interested in life. Stromberg wanted Charlie to tell him how he lived. Would Charlie be willing to spend time as a technical advisor on such a project? Charlie replied that he didn't want to get tied into anything long range because he never knew where he was going to be. But he agreed to call and to stop by when we were in town. As we left the lot, I was imagining success and fame. But Charlie wondered aloud, what would they do with Christ? Patty left town with us, left her unhappy friend, her troubled sister, her job, her car in a lot, and her savings account still saving itself. Mary rolled over that night with tornado force, pulling the covers with her. It was one thing sleeping 3 in a VW bus. Before, we had no reason to complain. Charlie had asked us if Patty could come along, and the truth was that she just fit. A stabilizer amongst women, a listener who demanded no attention for herself, an inspiration and conscience toward our own better attitudes. She was so easy to like that Mary couldn't stay mad. We gave her the coastal tour and through the Golden Gate. We went all around Haight Ashbury, between the psychedelic banners, painted vehicles, and acres of hippies. People of like spirit welcomed her, and she smiled, quietly thrilled. Patty deserved this vacation. Only in hindsight do I wonder at what cost. But at that time in her life, and under those circumstances, could she have done otherwise? Although a short distance apart in miles, the philosophical space between Haight Ashbury and Berkeley was wide. The university collected and spawned opinionated, often political people. In Berkeley, it seemed nearly everyone had something to proclaim. The feminist movement was gaining stride. A number of white women criticizing their male counterparts as either chauvinistic pigs or weaklings. Siding with minority men, they adopted the word oppression to say that they too had been enslaved. Ideological black Muslims and Panthers rejected their advances, interested only in furthering their own causes and in African American women. Charlie said that one reason he had not settled in society or married again was because he had seen men come to prison for women and abused by women. The dope peddler asks his wife, "Do you want me to do this kind of thing for a living?" And she says, "Baby, I don't like to see you put your life on the line, but it's up to you." They go back and forth. He says, "Well, we got a new home, new car, and money in the bank. Should I quit and get a square job? Will the kids make it on what we've got? I won't make this kind of money at a straight job, but then, if I keep on like this, I might get busted." She says, "You're right. Put the house and bank account in my name." And tears come to everyone's eyes when the judge says, 50 years. 3 years go by. Joe has come over to the house to help the lost wife of his best friend, and he's going to sell a little dope so she can get her man out of jail. Joe just loves the kids, so what's wrong with him moving into the big empty room that no one uses? He can deal right from the heart of the leftover people his friend was dealing to. Wife can't understand why her husband's going crazy. After all, she tried to visit, so she decides to get a divorce. She had to sell the house for her mom's doctor bills, but on the other side, her and Joe are going to move into a new house. Things I've seen all my life and didn't know right or wrong or judge. The man who took a shotgun and robbed banks because his dick was too small and his woman never happy. The man who shot someone a week before his wedding and lost his wife-to-be. But his mom comes every visiting day. I never thought of myself as thinking anything, but I've seen it. I don't judge it or not judge it. I just see it. Charles Manson, circa 1976, California State Prison. I said, "You can't blame everything on women." He said, "Exactly. And you can't blame everything on men. Most men are doing what they're taught to do, by a woman. When the woman puts all the blame on the man, I just put it back. She's blaming part of herself. Then she runs to put her problems on the black man in the name of help. Maybe he thinks he's won a prize. He's been taught she's better than his woman, but in soul, he knows. The real African man thinks white people look like bloodless turnips. You got years of TV and movies telling people what's good looking. How do you think that makes the black man feel? He's been taken away from himself." The next time we saw Gary Stromberg at Universal Studios, he had moved into a larger office, and his conversation was frequently interrupted. Between phone calls, he explained that the Christ movie hadn't yet gelled in his mind, but the one thing he had decided for sure was that Christ should be black. This did not come as a surprise to Charlie. He told Stromberg that the important thing was not the color of Christ, but the thought he was projecting. For over 1,000 years, he said, Christian religious leaders have held up the cross, purporting to speak for Christ. Christ, he contended, was misrepresented. He also told Stromberg that making Christ black was Stromberg's attempt to calm his fears and pay off feelings of guilt. Black people, he said, should be allowed to make themselves in their own image, instead of being manipulated by white people into images not their own. Stromberg wasn't sure he understood, but his mind was on more immediate productions. He said he would have more time to work on the Christ movie later, and that Charlie should stay in touch. A retired sociologist from the prison on McNeil Island had contacted Charlie's parole officer, extending an invitation for Charlie to visit his home in Washington State. The parole officer thought it would be a positive trip and granted permission for Charlie to leave California. We set off right away, but took our time. We camped in Oregon and Washington with all of the natural amenities: plush green carpets, songbird canopies, clear water and air. For brief interludes, we heard the summer symphony without one beep, whine, or groan from a machine, and were the only humans on Earth. Charlie actively imagined being one of the first. Using a walking stick, he pretended to vault a river, make a tent, and spear food. He thought aloud about a world in which other animals walk around man, because a true Earth man can face his fellow animals, and they naturally know to respect him. Man's dominion over animals, he said, is natural dominance, not subjugation. It's a given, not something taken. Without doubt, people would know that. The religious allegory about Adam and Eve's original sin, he suggested, could be seen as Adam doubting himself, permitting the woman to take him from his nature, his word, and the God in himself. But as much as he pointed up the gender divide, he wasn't cruel or dismissive or condescending or disrespectful in any of the ways we had seen some men behave toward women in our lifetimes. He made love to all of us together. He didn't encourage us to instigate the action, preferring instead to direct the moves and expecting nothing from us but that we receive him. By earnestly working for our fulfillment, he held our attention and raised it. We became responsive to the slightest touch, and he was not overwhelmed by sensations until he had raised us above thought and brought us down gently, the sweat dripping from a curl over his brow. Tucked into woods that night, he said that all the money in the world was not worth the experience of being there with us. And then he and Mary had a fight. We had driven off the highway to survey a possible campsite when they exchanged a few words. He braked the bus. She opened the door and got out. Charlie met her at the front of the bus. She swung at him. He took her arm. She grabbed his jacket, and they tugged and wrenched and scuffled. Inside the bus, Patty and I watched. wrestling worry and heartbreak while mindlessly munching potato chips. As our hands collided going into the bag, we had the same funny thought of being at a drive-in movie. Returning to the action, we saw Mary take off towards the woods. Charlie was sweaty and somewhat torn up. He got into the bus, took some breaths, and started driving slowly behind her until, hot and exhausted, she also gave up. Nothing more was said of it. Each of us girls was a little stubborn and a little lazy. Charlie liked to take walks on what he called the hard paths, between thorn bushes and fallen trees. At first I considered these walks an imposition, but we became thinner, stronger, and more agile, and, without wanting to admit it, we began welcoming the opportunities to flex. On mornings when the bus wouldn't start, we got out to push it, grumbling silly one-liners, while the chauvinistic chauffeur steered and coasted, never missing an opportunity to show off woman power. It was as though we had never seen cows. We were hungry for the sight of any animal, and they were so close to the road that Charlie pulled the bus behind their fenced meadow, and we got out. In the stillness, accentuated by ticking insects and the calls of mourning doves, we ruminated on their lives. They had no ambitions or aspirations, no hopes of becoming horses or goats. They fulfilled their purposes, grazing, mating, giving birth, and nourishing not only their young, but millions of the rest of us. Charlie said that despite our dominion over animals, he would rather see more alive than on plates. Did we really need to eat them? I had been raised on 2 to 3 meals of beef, pork, lamb, or fowl a day, and for all I knew, the rest of the world had as much. I liked meat. It was nourishing, but in a land of abundant alternatives, did I need it? In the following days, I became aware of half-eaten hamburgers stuffed into trash bins and on fast food parking lots. People had become bloated, thoughtless, wasteful, and, ironically, unsatisfied. It was a habit we would break. In a university town, needing money, Charlie said that he was headed for the student dining room to play music and pass the hat. He repeated that we were welcome to join him, but being too shy to sing, the rest of us set out in broad daylight to ask strangers for money. Mary bolstered herself, saying, "We just gave away a $200 trailer, some bongo drums, and we almost gave away the grand piano." None of us had panhandled before, but we'd heard the lingo in Haight Ashbury. "Got any spare change?" I felt compelled to add lengthy explanations that proved less effective than getting to the point. Nobody wanted to hear why we needed it. As a sideline, and maybe to feel normal, We stopped to chat with the students. Patty was a natural at interviewing people. At the end of the day, sure, we recalled a few unflattering names, but we'd gone through our spare changes and were returning to the bus, laughing with a whopping $6. With his guitar, Charlie had received more than $15 in less than 20 minutes. He'd had a crowd gathered in the student union when an administrator told him to leave. The rest of the afternoon, he'd socialized, had lunch at some girl's house, and was invited to a fraternity party. The next day, he talked a gas station owner into getting his plate glass windows washed for another $6 and 4 ice cream bars. Lapping ice cream as he watched us, he mentioned that one day we might want to play tambourines and sing. Passing through almost any town, Charlie noted the signs on commercial buildings. It was a curiosity to him that people aspired to have their names on laundromats and such. Not that he was against such signs. Exiting a shop, he said, "Guy tells me business is bad. If he put up a better sign, he'd have more customers. You can't see that sign where it is." He claimed that people didn't realize their potential. If a guy wanted to go into the restaurant business, he could start with a broom and be managing the place within a year. It sounded like hyperbole until he explained. Say he goes in the restaurant and starts sweeping the floor every day for an hour or so. He acted the happy sweeper. The manager asks him what he's doing, and the guy says, "I just wanted something to do. I don't mind sweeping floors." And the guy is harmless and he don't accept pay. Maybe a cup of coffee or a bowl of soup. So pretty soon the people who run the place get used to him, get to know him, and like him. He's useful. And he comes in and says with more authority, "You know, if you move those tables over there, there'll be more room for people to walk. Or if you clear this window and hang some planters, some people can sit in the sun and enjoy the plants." You know, little improvements, and it brings in more customers and makes more money. And pretty soon the owner is asking the guy what to do, tossing him the keys and saying, "Lock up when you leave." Charlie frequently had money-making ideas, he mentioned only in passing. Then he'd say, "These people got me thinking about making money." Or, "That's my old self. It's all most cons can think about, the fastest way to make money." He said there wasn't much difference between legal and illegal cons, and he acted out a number of TV commercials, pointing out subliminal messages put together by highly paid psychologists whose intent was to target human weaknesses. The sexual innuendos he noticed were implausible to me. He gave as example a deodorant commercial in which a man and woman were running towards each other on a train platform, the man carrying a pink elephant. Just before they embraced, the elephant's trunk bobbed in her face to the announcer's words, "At the peak, the peak of your excitement." Charlie said he once knew a bunco artist who talked wealthy middle-aged women into investments by offhandedly holding a rolled-up magazine near his crotch and bobbing it now and then for emphasis. He said it sufficiently distracted some women to bamboozle their better judgments. These were the kind of psychology discussions I'd expected, but didn't get in college. The towns and counties of Washington state are rife with Native American names, most famously Seattle, the chief of the Squamish peoples. We crossed into the state just after dark, hungry and needing gas. Charlie spotted a coffee house where he thought he could sing for our dinner. It was the middle of the week, and more than half of the wooden tables were empty. So he talked the manager into letting him take his guitar on stage, and we three sat at different tables applauding. The place filled up in half an hour. Charlie proceeded to charm the crowd, and during a rousing applause, the manager walked across the stage and spoke in Charlie's ear. He then took the microphone and announced, "This is Charlie Manson. He'll be here at the club every night for the next 2 weeks." We were surprised. So was Charlie. He later told us he'd only given the man his name. He was never asked and hadn't agreed to anything. The next afternoon, around Steilacoom, we stopped to see the father of one of Charlie's ex-cell partners. Bent and gray, he was watering his flower bed and didn't even look up as Charlie approached to ask about his son. When the man finally did answer, it was in disjointed sentences, like a picture of a room in which all the furniture and appliances are floating, or just in the wrong places. Just as natural as every day, Charlie spoke to that man in similar strange sentences. The man replied, and Charlie in turn. Though Charlie said little as we drove away, I got the impression that something had hurt that man so much he preferred to live in a world apart. McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary was opened in 1875 off the Washington coast and under the splendor of Mount Rainier. Washington was not yet a state, but a U.S. territory. Railroads had not reached the area, and ship was the fastest mode of transport. So the island site was perfect for prisoners. At the end of its first year, the prison's total population was just 9 inmates and 2 guards. The first recorded inmate, Abraham Gervais, had been sentenced to 20 months for selling alcohol to Indians. By 1911, a second cell house briefly held Robert Stroud, sympathetically portrayed by movie actor Burt Lancaster in The Birdman of Alcatraz. According to prison ledgers, Stroud had attacked and stabbed an inmate orderly, receiving for the infraction a disciplinary transfer to Leavenworth, Kansas. For about 60 years more, McNeil Island continued to confine convicted men from any state or protectorate. Charlie talked about some of them. Of interest to me were a Native American who had done 15 years for stealing a pig, because he kept violating the conditions of his parole, and a cackling old lunatic who wrapped and hid small presents for guards to find on their typically shit-disturbing cell shakedowns. Before the other prisons opened, Charlie said, there was a big cross-section of people there. I knew a Guam Island man with a face full of tattoos, and an Eskimo who fished through the ice and could live apart from the supermarket. There was Africans. The difference between an African and a U.S. Negro is night and day. We found the Sociologist in a 2-story house on the tree-lined outskirts of the city, and we were met at the door by a trim woman in a shirtwaist dress. She was the lady of the house, but we'd barely said hello before the man was shaking Charlie's hand and inviting us into their living room. The house was spacious and orderly, with polished wooden furniture, including a huge leather chair in the study, where shelves were filled to the ceiling with books. The Sociologist was eager to tell Charlie about his new job as a teacher. Glad to be out of the prison business, he seemed to align himself more with inmates than with staff. He wondered if Charlie was still playing the guitar and thinking of making a career of it. Charlie said that he'd been locked up so many years, he was just out looking at life. He recounted some of the places we'd been and talked about the new music. The Beatles' music has a lot of subliminal in it, he told the Sociologist. You would know about that. The Sociologist said he hadn't really listened to it. Charlie sang a Beatles song about turning off the mind, relaxing and floating downstream. He laughed, saying, "You know, I learned all that in the hole, but I didn't know I knew it, man." He said, "You ought to see all the hippies in San Francisco. It's a new culture." The Sociologist hadn't entirely caught up to the cultural changes, but he said he was 100% in agreement with the anti-war movement. He lamented at length the war and worldwide hunger. Charlie wondered what he had done to rectify his feelings, asking if he'd consider selling his furniture and sending them the money. The Sociologist caught himself mid-sputter. "Well, no," he said. "I don't think that would... We give in our own way. I don't want to argue, Charlie." Charlie appealed. "I'm not arguing, man. I'm listening to what you say." The Sociologist's wife had disappeared, and we heard pots and pans in the kitchen. After a while, we knew it was time to leave. The Sociologist followed us out to the porch, telling Charlie how good it was to see him, and extending his best wishes. He said, "We may not be hippies, Charlie, but we want to end war, poverty, and hunger as much as anyone." Charlie's next words were quiet but direct. He said, "You had 4 hungry people sitting in your living room, and you offered them nothing." The Sociologist reached in his pocket, but Charlie said, "No, man. Keep your money." We drove to an area of smaller homes, where a bearded man let us park for the night. The Sociologist found us the following day. He said, "Charlie, you're right. You really are right. I'm sorry. Please take this." Again, he offered money. "Look," Charlie said firmly, "I don't mean to make you feel bad." "Not everyone is there yet, Charlie," the Sociologist said. "Not everyone can do what you do. I envy you, Charlie." The sociologist had much more property to lose than we did, and he had worked years for it. The fact that he felt guilty about having it was an underlying problem for him. Then again, he was passing that guilt on. As a teacher, his words about war and hunger would affect younger people into action. They could work out the problems. He could keep his furniture. At late afternoon, Charlie turned the bus down a dirt road marked dump. But instead of rubbish at its end, we found a clearing and a clean wood on the banks of the Puget Sound. We explored, unloaded equipment, built a fire, and began cooking before Charlie asked, "Do you feel something?" I didn't, but Mary and Patty said they did. It was dusk. Charlie asked, "Do you sense somebody?" We looked around us. Nobody was coming. It seemed to him that they already were there. He said we were trespassing, and he thought we should go. Without further discussion, we dumped the food, packed up the bus, and drove out at nightfall. That was the second time I heard him allude to spirits. The next day, we looked for a good place to camp. Most land was privately owned. Charlie said, "The Indians knew the land belongs to no one and everyone, but they were called dumb savages." In the cool afternoon, Charlie sat against a tree, talking to a squirrel in a neighboring tree. I was thrilled to see the slinky little body move down the tree trunk and pause, staring at him. Holding down my breath and movement, I watched it cautiously cross the ground, coming so close to him that he could touch it. When, into that silence, a terrifying growl sent the squirrel into the underbrush. It was Charlie. When the blood returned to my brain, I was furious. I couldn't believe he had done that. He got up and passed us, saying with disgust, "The next human he trusts may blow his head off. It's not time." It was at this point in my experience of him that the Charles Manson of court records began to display misanthropic ideology. More likely, a pre-existing condition was aggravated when on the unused roads, in the deepest woods, and even in the streams we found wrappers, cans, and toilet paper. He said, "Animals are smarter than people. They don't shit and piss in the water they drink. You couldn't pay me to go to one of your schools," he said furiously. "I'd eat dirt first." We were driving up a fire road when Charlie asked if we wanted the bus. He put on both brakes, turned off the engine, and got out, telling Mary to hand him the pink slip. Placing it on the seat so that anyone could own the bus, he told us to take our things and come along if we were coming, or to take the bus and go. We followed him up a steep wooded mountain in the heat of the day. But after 30 minutes, an hour, we dropped down, deciding not to go farther. From a distance, he turned to look at us, and slowly his face reflected our displeasure. I don't care, he told us, with no trace of feeling. When you lay down your mind and die, you'll find me. He spoke to us as one woman, turned and continued up the mountain. We stayed put, defiant, angry, sad, and at an impasse unprecedented in our lives. Our tears came as a relief. After a time, I accepted myself as human, and humanity as good, foibles and all. Mary and Patty must have experienced something similar, for we started up the mountain, laughing and calling for him. A voice unlike his came back, mortally wounded. It said, "Go away." I thought he was angry at us. Then I saw him higher on the mountain. Not the Charlie we knew, but an animal on the edge of a cliff. The sunset reflected in empty holes of his eyes. Looking across the fumes rising from the city below, I had the thought that some in its throngs would tramp to every hidden place on earth to destroy him. He had seen the crumpled cans, the trees stumped and burnt. We'd heard the silence after the shot. I thought I was facing human nature, but I'd barely glimpsed it. He disappeared. When we saw him again, he was absently drifting past us, looking through us as if we were not. And then he paused to speak with a leaf, and no words I had ever heard, and I thought he had gone insane. A cool night was settling over the mountain. He lay on his back in a bed of leaves. We wouldn't leave without him, but we didn't want to stay. We were unready. So as darkness came, we lay down near him, crying. And after a while, he reached out of his private world and drew us in. Together, we became a warm energy. He said something like the old Charlie would say, and he agreed, without words, to come down the mountain. The 1960s busted out of the bland 50s, so radically changing the world, it's surprising more ordinary adults didn't lose their minds. Homeless waifs roamed the city. Marijuana was ubiquitous. Police were divided on the issue, some pursuing users with deadly force, while others shrugged off recreational use as harmless. Cocaine and heroin were not popular amongst hippies, but marijuana and psychedelics were virtually in every patchwork pocket and satchel. One day, I entered a room where Father Mike was standing over his open briefcase. In it were many plastic bags of marijuana and LSD. Beyond the startled second, he closed the case and behaved as though I'd seen nothing. I think now that Father Mike may have been a distributor for the Brotherhood of Love. Each generation has its end of the world scenario, and our end was imminent. All establishments and institutions seemed less stable. Communism, which seems to raise its head whenever the heads of other isms duck, appeared with several heads around the globe, shocking the capital holders into reactionary militarism and the tepidly religious to fundamentalist rebirth. Thousands of young men were drafted into military service, and few knew why they were fighting. People had burned themselves to death to protest the war, including a Quaker man who had poured gasoline over himself and his baby daughter below the office of the Secretary of Defense. Catholic priest brothers, Daniel and Philip Berrigan, the latter a decorated World War II veteran, led draft card burnings and encouraged desertion. Repulsed politicians called these and other respected Americans communists, further confusing the definition. On October 21st, 1967, in Washington, D.C., more than 100,000 anti-Vietnam War protesters gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. The next day in San Francisco was my 19th birthday, and nobody even gave me a card. That's where my head was. Charlie finally answered my sullen disappointment by explaining that he didn't think of birthdays because they always had been like any other day to him. He consoled me with humor and later suggested that we could be born every morning, celebrate the day, and rest in peace at night. It was something to think about, a different perspective, a change of attitude. I have never in my life been able to look down on anybody because I've always been at the bottom. So my anger and frustrations, I've always had to go to solitary confinement and take it out on who? You know, on me. And I'd stare at the wall and make music in my head. But then it gets to a point where solitary is peace. And when things got hectic in the yard, I'd just go up to the man and say, "You dirty so-and-so." So he'd put me in the hole. And I'd lay in the hole for 2 or 3 weeks, and I'd hum. So when I got out of prison, I take some acid that a young girl gave me on the street. I look at everybody, and I see they don't know what they're doing. They all say, "Well, so-and-so said this, or maybe around the corner, or ask him, or it said in this book." But nobody can say, "I know." So I look at it and I say, "Wow, what an insane world you live in, Jerry Rubin. What a madhouse you live in. I just got to look at your world at 33 years old. And the police are hitting kids, and they direct the kids to work off their karma for past debts. You know, all of their guilt for what's been done to the black man, to the Indians, and the kids get their heads beat for it. The kids have always gotten the world their parents left them." Charles Manson, 1970. From a visit with political activist Jerry Rubin. Father Mike and Charlie still talked ethics, religion, and God, but Mike's reactions, alternately enthusiastic and doubtful, were more extreme. He seemed to be struggling to etch life into platitudes, and frustrated when, with a spirit of its own, it refused him. One night, psychedelically bouncing between the celestial firmament and subterranean fires, Mike's face contorted into demonic grimaces one moment, and glowed with beatific adoration the next. Charlie was telling him that the church needed to come to new understandings. What God and Jesus conveyed 2,000 years ago was for that time. The cross, like the pyramids, were put in the minds for reasons beyond common understandings. God always comes upon the earth to balance when needed. The earth nowadays is full of God on different levels. To Mike's training, this was blasphemy. But what it was to his sense caused him pause. Charlie said, "Even if churches try to put a monopoly on it, truth belongs to everyone, kings and sheep." He said, "The monks in Indiana said they had the real Christ. And since then, I've heard hundreds of people say their Christ is the one. Who can own Christ? Christ is a thought. Coming into the brotherhood of Christ means giving up everything and starting over. And that's not easy. Rebirth is not easy. Churches buy and sell it, but it's not easy to leave a world and all you know. I was only smart enough to learn I was dumb. That left me with 3 years of school, a card game, a few jail games, not much else." Mike stated, "You believe you're God." Charlie said, "God and Jesus are in our nature, man. Father and Son. The Indians knew everything is God. The sun, the moon, the river, the land. But you can only see God when you see you're His creation. Through you, all is His experience." Mike ventured archly, "And what about Satan? Is Satan in our nature?" Charlie replied, "If you insist. Sure, if that's what you want." He grinned. "But as God is all faith, the real devil would have to be doubt and anything that separates us from God." San Francisco's philanthropic spirit blew minds, and then it was gone. From Mike's stereo, the Doors were singing, "This is the End," about the time that the Diggers were having a funeral. A casket with a large banner proclaiming the death of hippie was carried down Haight Street, and they left town. The atmosphere changed. On each of our visits, the Haight showed more signs of decay. Rats and zombies gnawing at the central heart of it. Father Mike said the LSD market had been flooded with everything from sugar to strychnine by people out to make a buck. The free clinic was getting poisoning cases and freakouts. Every day we'd see gaunt, ashen creatures buying cheap poisons in dark doorways. Someone stumbling down an alleyway, or in the back of some slick dick's car. Charlie returned to Mike's house one afternoon with wet, vacant eyes. He had had no room to offer a couple of young runaways. So the next day, we were headed north, out of a place where there weren't enough places to find a bigger bus. Chapter 6. Happy Birthday Poem. Should I live 100 lives, be enslaved by foolish dreams of others, wake and walk dead with no will, knowing fear rules? Rules, not thoughts from church or schools, Words used as tools, running fools. Crying, why, mama? Why? Music lie, babies cry, and run fast after their mothers. Preachers preach, teachers teach, as brothers kill brothers. I'm so dumb I ain't got a mouth, or smart words to send. Went north and ended south. How to begin? Look out, wrong way. I'm losing track of night and day. And say, why, mama? Why? World of fatherless children, I know and say, ain't you got no eyes, world? Look, look, you're going the wrong way. It takes a fool to see a fool, and you know, fool, I see. Money's got your mind, bread's got your head. Diamonds are glass, man, and gold's just lead. I said like your head's lead, and who's who in Humpty Dumpty's minds. Bones are brittle, all's in the middle, and insane eyes do shine. Can you see back through all your heads, living forever in no time? Whose thoughts are you stuck in? Or can I explain there's nothing to teach? Where's the breached breach? All is a part of the one that we must die to reach, yet not reaching for another, and giving on the sneak. For who understands? Why, mama? Why? Only your father. Charles Manson. Letter from Los Angeles County Jail, 1971.